Right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this presentation and for listening. My name is Dr. Dieu Hack-Polay, and I'm an associate professor in organization studies at the Lincoln International Business School, University of Lincoln. I teach largely human resource management and research methodologies, but my research interest lies in the area of migrant workers. And in essence, I look at migrants and their contribution to new economies. So the place that migrants occupy in the new economies, and how the integration process that ensues their arrival is carried out for them to be effective part of the landscape. So that's the sort of things I'm going to talk about today. And as I said, with the George Floyd issue, killing in the United States, and other unfortunate tragic events as well, affecting minority groups and migrants, it is an important area of investigation now. And I'm pleased to see that a lot more of us are coming to the field to highlight the issues that we have, but also the possibilities that we have with that. I've been doing this type of research for over 20 years, and during which I've published a number of books and journal articles nationally and also internationally. So thank you again for coming to my presentation, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. So we can now start. Right, okay. My presentation, as we can see here, is entitled the effective migrant integration into the communities. So in essence, what I've tried to do here is to look at how the economic and the social infrastructures that the migrant land in hinder or contribute to the integration in the society. So I'm pursuing three objectives here, just to contain the sort of things that we're going to look at in this presentation. So I'll try to examine what I call here the endogenous and exogenous conditions for effective migrant integration. So in essence, what the migrants themselves do and what the external society does in order to facilitate migrant integration. The other bit that I'm going to look at is to try to examine what I call social solidarity, which is an important concept that in terms of social life and societal arrangement is critical for the relationship between people. And we'll also look at the role of ethnic enclaves in migrant integration. This is really looking at how migrants landing in a new society tend to cluster themselves in some groups or particular areas of our society, whether it's physical or cultural, that we call enclaves. So yeah, that gives us a broad idea of what we're going to cover. But let's look at some kind of introductory thought. Usually when we talk about migrant, it looks like we are looking at the poor people or deprived people who come to our countries. But if we look at some of these names here, particularly famous people like Albert Einstein, coming to the United States from the Second World War, Miriam Makeba, famous singer from South Africa, Karl Marx, a famous economist from Germany. So all these people exemplify the fact that migration is not just for poor people who flee from particular social or political conditions. So all sorts of people from all sorts of life have been migrants at some point in their lives. And migration also carries on with famous biblical migrants such as Joseph, or Daniel, or even Jesus Christ has been a migrant at some point. And if we look at, for example, in the book of Matthew in the Bible, talking about Jesus being a migrant, the scriptures tell us that an angel will come and speak to Mary and Joseph and telling them, get up and take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you to come back, because Herod is going to search for a child to kill him. So this is really a way of saying that migration has been inherent to human societies and histories. So it's not anything new. But all the fuss, all the discourses around migration now, particularly negativities, are almost telling us that this is a new phenomenon. But it is not new, as we can demonstrate through the evidence that we have in front of us. So for this presentation, what I'm going to do is to try to look at the 3 different pieces of work that I've done and try to collate them together to create that notion of effective migrant integration in the communities. So I built on one of the articles that I wrote recently. I mean, these are the most recent. I've written several articles and books before, but I have come back recently to revisit the evidence that I collected before in order to extend the work that I've done in 10 or 20 years ago. So I build on migrant enclaves, disempowering economic ghettos or sanctuaries of opportunity for migrants. Basically, what I'm debating in this article is the notion of migrant enclaves and their validity in migrant integration. So when migrants cluster themselves within enclaves, does it help or hinder the integration process? And again, recently, I've written another piece with my colleague, Dr. Paul Higué, where we look at the role of voluntary agencies in the integration of migrants in communities. So we basically look at those external forces that I talk about. Those I set out to look at endogenous and exogenous conditions for migrant integration. So in this article here, we discuss the role of voluntary agencies in this integration. And again, more recently, with again my colleague Dr. Paul Higué and Dr. Medici, we look at the role of institutional and family embeddedness in the failure of sub-Saharan African migrant family businesses. So here we look at how intergroup and the intra-group solidarity concept that we'll be looking at become conditions for migrant integration as well. So as you will see, some of my earlier work will also be drawn upon, particularly a very well-cited text article I wrote a few years back entitled "When Home Isn't Home." Yeah. So that will take us into some of the other issues that hinder migrant integration. So what do we mean by migrant integration? I think the 3 works that I've highlighted are proposed in the 3 principles or 3 conditions for migrant integration. So we're talking about social embeddedness, which is really looking at migrants being able to fit in the social architecture of the new locality. We also talk about cultural embeddedness as a condition for migrant integration. So migrants being able to espouse some of the cultural values of a new locality, but also releasing or instilling some of their own values into the new collectivity. So there is a notion of exchange here that takes place in what we call cultural embeddedness. So we are not looking at cultural embeddedness as a cultural colonialism, where the dominant groups tend to force upon the new arrival their values, and therefore causing them to assimilate forcibly. And the third condition that we have here is economic embeddedness. So where the migrant can prosper, can be wealthy economically. So they have jobs, they have enterprises, and they have a position in our economic infrastructure. So in other terms, as I say here, we are looking at how migrants are empowered to play societal and citizenship role, and they become then a normal, ordinary citizen of a new locality. So 3 conditions. Yeah, we'll look at those 3 conditions as we look at our concept, our core concept of social solidarity, which is our main framework here. So, so in this particular bit, we discuss migrant integration in the lenses of social solidarity. And we've identified 2 dimensions of social solidarity, and I'll come back to explain the concept itself. But let's look at some broad frames around the concept. So we've got 2 notions here: inter-group solidarity and intra-group solidarity. So basically, the assistance that help migrants to integrate are twofold. Linking to the way they help one another. So it could come from within the group, and it could come from outside the group. So that's what we have termed intra for inside the group, and intergroup solidarity from outside the group. So I've formulated a conceptual framework here, a conceptual model here that really exemplifies some of the things that come under endogenous or exogenous conditions, and mapping them onto what I've called earlier intra-group solidarity and intergroup solidarity. So when we look at the gray stuff, so this is basically what we would call solidarity, the gray stuff here. But that solidarity, social solidarity, that is the main enabling factor for migrant integration, does not come out of a vacuum. It is constructed through different elements. And one of its elements is intra-group solidarity. So what we are saying here is that the migrants that come to a new collectivity have to help themselves. So they either take individual actions, they become courageous, and they come out there to express their individuality and contribute. So this is, and this can be done either through personal effort or through help that the more experienced migrant give to another. And I talk about migrant community organizations here, and I talk about ethnic groups, established ethnic groups, and also the enclaves will be instrumental to some degree in the integration of migrants. But the integration of migrants cannot be done according to our model unilaterally. So the migrant can't integrate himself unilaterally. There must be a sense of acceptance of the dominant new collectivity. So this is where we talk about the notion of intergroup solidarity. So, and within that, we have the exogenous factors, conditions that help migrant integration. So those external factors that are outside the migrant groups are to do with the state, for example. The state support through some training scheme, through some welfare support to get the migrant started is an important framework in some cases. We've got private company involved as well with the PPI initiatives, for example, and we've got the voluntary sector that is really heavily involved in migrant integration. And within that, we have other migrant groups that are not necessarily from the same collectivity as the new migrant. So, as we can see, social solidarity is probably the main framework. Without that, without the two dimension of social solidarity, we run the risk of failing the migrant, because integration is a joint venture, a joint activity by both the incoming group and the existing groups. So social solidarity is therefore the interplay, as I said, I promise I will define that. It's the interplay of trust, reciprocity, and altruism, and how these individual actions can advance towards collective action. So basically, we are looking at people acting together in order to come to a certain outcome. And the outcome is integration, where people embrace one another and they tend to live together in a social space. Social solidarity also emphasizes, as we've seen from the map that I've just shown you, the interdependence between individuals in a society, and that interdependence will allow individuals to feel that they can enhance their lives and the lives of other people. And so this is the perspective that Dow and Stuttgart and London have taken. And we also take that perspective because, it's that notion. I mean, when we look at the map that we've looked at, we can see clearly this interconnection, which means that actors, both new and old, have to work together. And this is what these authors here theorize in terms of collective action and interdependence. Durkheim was one of the very first to create the term social solidarity. Durkheim, the sociologist Durkheim, could be credited with that notion. And for him, for Durkheim, social solidarity is based on the autonomy of individual, the division of function, and functional interdependence. Again, the same term as our previous authors is here, and mutual exchange. So without that mutuality, integration can take place, because then there's no synchrony, there's no understanding, and understanding comes from mutual exchange and interdependence. That sense of interdependence makes it important for migrant integration. And Marcel Mauss, who was a Durkheim student, actually favors a different concept. And the concept he favors is social cohesion. And the social cohesion is fairly similar to the notion of interdependence. But it shows more firm actions taken by individual in order to live together as a collectivity or as a new collectivity, because we have different actors that are trying to blend together. And that's why we talk cohesion. We have to bring the pieces of our social system together. Or whether they are new systems, a new part of the system, or old part of the systems, they have to come together in order to work. So within that notion of social solidarity, we drew on the two notions. We talk about intra-group solidarity and intergroup solidarity. So within the intra-group solidarity, this is where we see endogenous conditions emerging. So conditions that come from within the group that then support the integration strategy. So these are, as I say here, enabling patterns of behavior or ways of organizing that are linked to the individuals and to their group. So, for example, we talk about language, we talk about people putting themselves forward to learn the language and the culture of the new collectivity, and people being in the groups, the migrant groups, which at first people might see as being exclusions, but in the end they contribute according to our evidence, the research that we've done, the migrant organizations tend to contribute to the psychological healing, because we know displacement is a factor that affects people's psychology. And things like I've talked about in my very popular article on homesickness. People living the original collectivities and groups will tend to feel homesick. So migrant groups and enclaves will tend to soothe the transition process between the old and the new. So this map here, we can clearly see the role that migrant groups will play here. So we call it intra-group solidarity, because the actions that take place to favor or to support migrant integration takes place or rotate within that migrant system. So it's, if you want, it's a closed system that has elements that are conducive to integration. We also have endogenous conditions, or what I called earlier intra-group solidarity. So so those are the, as I said, the endogenous sphere, which gives rise to what we characterized earlier as intra-group solidarity. So in this particular framework, the migrants don't draw too much or sufficiently from the outside world. They tend to be content in their group, support one another. But we also have outside the inner circle of the migrant, we have the external factors or external forces that tend to also affect the migrant integration. So these exogenous conditions, we see them as patterns of behavior that come from the society, and therefore bombard the migrants with new information and constrain them into really trying to understand what's going on in that new collectivity. So the input from other communities that have been there a long time, the assistance from statutory groups or voluntary agencies or private sector would all come in there to try to help migrants to fully express themselves and integrate the new society. So the inherent social cultural sphere is really what we're talking about here. You've got new cultures that the migrants are trying to experience, and the forces of those cultures tend to come to infiltrate, if you want, not necessarily collide. Sometimes they do collide with the migrant cultures, but I tend to use them infiltrate. They come to penetrate the migrant sphere in order to alter the migrants' behavior and lead them to cohesion. Using Moses' term. So if we look at some examples here, we've got examples of exogenous forces. So we've talked about other ethnic groups, the private sector providing jobs, training, or on-the-job training, or these sort of things, or funding for training. We've got the voluntary sector that provide advice, counseling, befriending, referral systems, and training as well. We've got universities that also provide advice, training, and research in order to lead to a greater understanding of the migrant situation and therefore informing policy matters. And we've got a state itself that is a key player in terms of policy development and the funding and so forth. So I've got a few examples here of exogenous conditions. So in the 1990s, early 1990s, a bank like the National Westminster Bank, for example, sent the managers to community groups to go to help those groups to develop. But in return, those managers came back with some learning, because they learn how the hardship of the voluntary sector, despite that hardship, the voluntary sector was really keen on advancing the work and enabling migrant integration. So basically, what we are saying here is that the exogenous factors come into the world of migrant, can also benefit from the world of migrant with new learning that they take back to their own collectivities. So this is really where Durkheim earlier quoted the talk about a mutual exchange and interdependence. If we take this step to truly learn from one another, the migrant learning from the locals and the locals learn from migrant, will create a new dynamic and a new set of learning that is beneficial for both spheres. We, in our research with my colleague Paul Igwe as well, we look at the voluntary sector in action. And basically, the migrants were infused, if you want, by the kindness showed by the voluntary sector, that helped them to feel at home and remove the sense of homesickness and make them feel part of the collectivity through generosity, normal kindness, altruism, as we said earlier. So our respondent in that particular study found that the voluntary organization that helped them work with compassion. And this is part of solidarity, part of social solidarity, compassion, understanding the condition of other people, particularly the vulnerable. That is part of social solidarity. And the voluntary sector organizations have been critical in showing that side of our society. Another example of universities, one of the universities I have known before was quite instrumental in delivering service to new migrants. So basically, the university will offer taster courses and events in those community groups, visit them to run some open days in those migrant enclaves, and empower them then to understand the weight of higher education in migrant integration. And in return, when those migrants were ready for university, to embrace a university, they turned to that university because that was the only partner they have known. So what we are saying here, exogenous actions, or those positive actions that societal agents do towards migrants, come back with some positive returns for those organizations. So having said that, if we look at effective migrant integration, I start with a framework. The framework that really look at migrants and locals being in parallel lines, where we had intra-group solidarity. So the migrant did their own thing, that's one model, and another model where the external environment in the new society tried to pounce onto the migrants in order to force them into change. But in isolation, those models don't work. And the model I came up with is an integrative model, which is really looking at migrant organizations sitting here, doing their own thing. And on the other side, we have the external forces coming onto the migrant. So the migrant tend to integrate some of these values, but in return, as we can see here, within those arrows, the migrant then release some of their own values, their own cultures into the locality. And that blended approach tends to create social cohesion. So integration, migrant integration is a dual effort from the migrants themselves and also from the local collectivity. To create a new set of a collectivity, which has both set of actors present and well. So, if we look at the problematic then of the migrant groups and enclaves, the research evidence that we have from our research is that migrants tend to cluster not by their own free will necessarily, but the enclaves are constrained by the social system. If we look at, for example, the George Floyd killing in the United States, that is bringing all these protests around the world, we can see American society being fairly divided. If you go to New York, for example, there are districts where the blacks will tend to live, and there's some districts where the Asians will tend to live. So this clustering of the social system is engineered, is caused by some of the issues that we have already identified. We talked about racism, we talked about discrimination, and for the black people, for example, this has been constructed over 400 years through slavery, and at the end of slavery, through segregation, and so forth. So the germs, if you want, of enclaves were seeded by the social system. So I use the term problematic here because I'm talking about a migrant enclave, not to signify necessarily a problem, but I'm talking about problematic in terms of issues with migrant enclave. Because I talked about earlier, I said the enclaves have some positives, some positivities. They can help heal the psychological problems that migrants have when they leave their country, particularly the problems of homesickness, of dislocation and social isolation, and these sort of things. So I'm not saying that migrant enclaves are a problem, but they present issues. So there's no insinuation at all, as I said, that the migrant enclaves are problematic, are problems. But we need to look at those enclaves more dialectically. So look at both sides of the argument. So they play a positive role, as I said before, in the healing. So when migrants come to a new society, it makes sense for them to go to people that they can relate to. Yeah, that is not a problem at all. And that's where Ngongolo, Akenda, and Chrysostom have found that, these migrant enclaves are actually a catalyst for developing the necessary social capital. Because people who understand the language, the culture, and the psychology of the new migrant will help them through the transition process. But on the other side, there could be issues that I'll be talking about. So the peer support that is available in migrant networks is incredible. It's really important in settling the new migrant in the new collectivity, as Decker and Ingerson also found. Our research evidence points to the same. So psychological healing is an important thing that migrant enclaves have. There's also the community centers network that people have. People reporters in the 1990s found that it's really, really important for migrants to have that sense of being in a place of familiarity, as opposed to a really distant and unknown place. So it does protect them against what I call here the social shame. And the Sheehan Gulf also found incredible evidence about this. People who come to a new place where they don't speak the language, particularly, or they speak it badly, they tend to go to a place that provides them social reassurance or psychological safety, protecting them against social shame. So for the first years or the first few months, that's entirely fine. It provides also economic assistance, by people helping one another with a bit of money or a bit of jobs and so forth. But our evidence also found that there could be some issues within the migrant enclaves. So when migrants tend to cluster themselves in particular part of our society, because not because they have chosen it, but because our social system excludes them through discrimination, through the lack of jobs, and these sort of things. The migrants then cluster themselves and they become what we have called here ghettos. And the migrant ghettos then become a problem for our society. So the migrants themselves, as I say, are not a problem. But the social system, turning them into ghettos, then problematize the migrant enclaves, because these become places of deprivation. They become places where the migrant usually are left on their own with a hard or significant level of poverty and sometimes illiteracy, lacking of training, and so forth. So, so those migrant organizations will tend to over-reassure and look after the new migrant, and therefore causing them to be fairly dependent on those migrant organizations. And this dependency on the migrant organizations and on the migrant enclave maybe disempowers, if you want, the migrant. So they feel uncomfortable then going outside. The outside that persecutes them, that oppresses them, that denies them opportunities. So the only sanctuary they have is the ghettos or the enclaves. So that could be disempowering, and our evidence is not isolated. We've got Kindler, Racheva, and Piekowska, who found exactly the same thing. That we have social capital. Migrants have a lot of social capital that is then suffocated, that is not promoted within the migrant enclave. So we have that evidence. And also Elo and Taube and Wolowski found significant evidence to support the fact that it could be problematized. Migrants could be problematized, particularly when we look at factors such as religion and economics. It could potentially alienate members, and we can look at Steins and Johnson's writing, for example, who clearly point to the contradiction of the role of migrant networks. There could be something that could be dysfunctional and place the migrant in what I call here ambivalent position, midway to nowhere between the host land and the home country. So basically, migrant networks tend to not by their own doing or fault, as I said before, but tend to be forced by the social system to operate that way, to protect their own members or to overprotect their own members, and those members then become fairly dependent or very dependent on the migrant network. Once you are dependent on a certain network, you can't come out. And some vulnerable migrants tend to remain in those networks. Right, okay. I think I'm coming to a conclusion now. And I think we have to face the reality. With the George Floyd killing, with all these reports that we have about inequalities, about lack of integration, we have to face the unavoidable truth. And this is that we advocate in our own case here, that the integration initiative that we have needs to be set in a multicultural context. We can't have a case where the section of the population, like for example in the United States, is mostly black people who are killed by the police, who are denied the good jobs and facilities or justice altogether. And we can't set integration initiative in that context. It has to be an integrated, cohesive context as we looked at the notion of social solidarity. Yeah, because we have to try to create a framework that connects people. Because if we want cohesive societies where people feel safe and we have less crime and less confrontation, then we have to look at frameworks that connect people, so people can live together in the shared space. And that in turn, our evidence found, and Brinkerhoff also found a few months before, a few years before our research, that if we set the frameworks, the integration framework in this way, then we're creating more dynamic societies, because people can utilize the social capital, the cultural capital, and bring in what we call dynamic capabilities to support our communities and make them more vibrant communities. So finally, the concept of hybridity has been quite debated, but one way of seeing it, according to Chirau and Spivak, is really to bring people as close together as possible in order to create this sense of cohesion. And hybridity then becomes possibly a new framework, because integration tend to pose the problematic of one area being superior to the other. But hybridity or hybridization, according to Rao and Spivak, talks about really bringing people together and allowing people to bring something to the table. So we are recognizing equality, if you want. So from a very ontological perspective, Crady then argues that hybridity should be understood as a clear product of globalization. Now people travel around them and move around quite a bit. And as they move around, they bring their own cultures, their own social capital, cultural capital, that we probably have to embrace in order to dynamize our own collectivities and communities. So essentially, Crady argues that migrants tend to make communities dynamic because they bring something new. So in closing, we have to recognize that we are in this together, whether we are from South America, from Africa, from Asia, from America or Canada, whatever it is, we are in this together. A bit like in the corona context that we're in. Yeah, whether you are white, black, or green, we can all be infected by the corona. So we have to protect one another and we have to protect ourselves. So we are in this together. And what has been constructed over the thousands of years is quite difficult to disentangle in a short space of time. So we have entangled ourselves together, and it's quite difficult to disentangle ourselves. So what we are advocating in our research is the notion of embeddedness, that requires a collective action from both sides of the spectrum, migrant and locals. And only that sort of action will, in our research findings, brings about citizens who feel citizenship of the same cultural, physical, and social space. So I think, I hope I've covered some ground here. It's taken a bit of time, but I think it was important that I get to the end of that, because that's building on 3 different pieces of research. So thank you very much for listening. And you've got my details there. If you need to come back for any of these, this point to clarify, I'm quite happy to take questions via email or other social media platform. Thank you.